First item is approval of the minutes of the October 4th meeting. What are your wishes? They were in them.
I'll make a first motion to approve.
Second.
Moved by Harris, seconded by, by Mike? All those, or any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the minutes will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. On to the update on the focus groups. Eric, thank you for coming, and let me preface his remarks with the same comments he's going to make, but these are still in draft and preparatory stages, and they're still, because they just completed the work last week, these are preliminary, subject to additional thought and potential revision.
Thanks, John. Thank you, everybody. Good to see you in person. I want to respect your time, so I guess part of first question I have for everybody is, do we want to go through the 3 or 4 pages here, or are there some things that you would like to highlight? We can go in either direction. I'll just start out, and then if you want to jump in, you can be like the Supreme Court. You can just cut me off whenever you want and tell me where to jump in. Before I share anything, I want to echo what John said. These are very, very preliminary takeaways. Think of it as, we did about 6 to 7 focus groups, depending on how you count, roughly 6 to 8 people on average each. And this is the result of 4 individuals kind of eyeballing what we heard. And we did take notes, but, kind of eyeballing and thinking through what were our primary takeaways. We have not systematically gone through, and we will do that in the next couple of weeks here and try to get to you a more focused focus group report. I also want to highlight that, remember as we're looking through these, that the vast majority of Wausau residents and survey participants said that the Wausau police force is doing a good or very good job. So the task force deliberately chose to hear from people who were statistically slightly more negative or somewhat more negative in their approaches to the police and their attitudes toward the police. And I think that was the groups that you really wanted to hear a little more from. So just keep that in mind as we're looking through this. So many of the people in the focus groups reported personal interactions or witnessing interactions with the Wausau police that were negative, at least among the 40 to 45 people that we talked with. The following were some of the common themes that we observed or heard. And I'm specifically also going to point out that anything in here that sounds like a judgment is not written in the words or reflecting the views of myself or my research team. These are reflecting the judgments, if there are any judgments, of the people that we heard from in the focus groups. In any case, we want to acknowledge that many of the people in the focus groups were largely self-selecting. So some participants, in my opinion anyway, had been seeking to share their experience about the Wausau police and saw this as an opportunity. The first couple of groups we did were kind of catch-all groups, but we sent out invitations to people who work with those who have a history of mental health issues, substance abuse issues, people who have had encounters with the police in the last 12 months. So, there were definitely people who were ready to tell us about some negative experiences. So I just want to be upfront about that with some of these findings. While a few reported recent negative interactions with the local police, for others, we perceived a conflation of time, meaning for many, the trauma of past experiences that may have happened 10 years ago was still relevant for them today. And sometimes they had a hard time as they were describing an incident of kind of going back and forth between something that had happened years ago versus something that had happened recently. And I think that's important just to keep in mind. And I guess the only point I would make, though, is that to them, in their mind, the trauma was still very real, even if it happened a long time ago. And so I'm pointing this out because some of the things we heard may not reflect some of the current situations in terms of what's going on with policing in our community. We just have to acknowledge that. And subjects themselves acknowledge this, but at the same time, they had no evidence or experience to know if it had changed, so they were not convinced that things had changed, even if it's possible that they have. Some residents had a hard time separating to what extent their views were based on personal experience versus impressions based on negative national media accounts. And they actually acknowledged that both likely had an influence on their viewpoint. And I'm pointing this out because we tried very hard to, very specifically ask, now, do you think your opinion is based on an interaction you've had recently with police, or is it based on things that you've been hearing? We specifically asked those questions. And frequently, to the credit of the participants, they acknowledged that it was probably some of both, or at least that they acknowledged that the national media situation and the whole political situation in our country was likely influencing their viewpoints. We were struck by how many people in these so-called less approving demographics readily offered an empathetic recognition of how hard policing is, and how policing behavior might reflect the uncertainty and the possible threat that police face when they arrive at a scene. That theme emerged from nearly every single resident group, including the groups that had had more negative recent interaction with the police, people who were self-described former drug users and dealers. They still, almost to a person, had some positive things to say about police, which I think is very revealing. A reciprocal understanding of resident fears and rational reasons for poor citizen behavior was notably lacking in the two police groups that we spoke to. However, we want to acknowledge that we don't know exactly why this is the case, and it may be some concerns expressed by the police officers that we were able to have in our focus groups about the purpose of the focus groups themselves, and feeling a little defensive about being under scrutiny by the task force. But that's kind of speculation on my part. But my point is that there wasn't quite the same level of understanding of poor resident behavior compared to, say, the residents who had a little bit greater tolerance and understanding for why sometimes the police maybe act in ways that the residents didn't always appreciate. There were multiple stories in every group about the police coming to a scene with predetermined, in the minds of the focus group participants, predetermined about what was going on, failure to listen, failure to get all sides of the story, unnecessary rudeness, disrespect, and threats. However, nearly everyone articulated an awareness that policing is extremely difficult and that sometimes the police needed to be authoritative to do their jobs. And one thing to point out is when we tried to ask them specifically, well, at what point, did maybe some behavior that you would approve because, the situation might have been difficult versus maybe it was bordering on something inappropriate, it was hard for them to draw that line, right? So in other words, residents themselves, even those who have self-described negative interactions, can't always tell us where that line is. And I just think that's an important thing to know. Some participants expressed complete approval and satisfaction with their interactions with police officers. The Hmong group and the people that we interviewed and did a focus group who were of Hmong descent and background, in particular, on the whole, seem to be more positive about their interactions with local police than any of the other specific groups that we talked with. There was widespread recognition that the police are not equipped to be appropriate responders to mental health crises. This is not only among those who are non-police, but also within the police focus groups. Supervisors and non-supervisors all agreed that the police are really not totally equipped to deal with mental health crises. There was nearly universal acclaim for the CART model, though a few lamented the limited availability of CART. Police, both frontline and supervisors, seem to be concerned about mutual exclusion around resources for programs like CART. So in other words, while they praised CART, they were concerned that by increasing the funding to things like co-response programs would take away from patrol, which they felt was vitally important to them, and they felt they were already somewhat shorthanded there. And so if they continue to see that as a mutually exclusive trade-off, then they aren't necessarily in favor of expanding CART, but they would if they felt the resources were available for all. Non-police participants expressed a strong and nearly universal desire for more police training around mental health issues. This was a very strong common theme and recommendation by almost every participant. Police participants, meanwhile, saw a clear delineation between their primary jobs and responsibilities and additional mental health training. In other words, they recognize that they are not mental health professionals and are troubled by the increasing expectation that they must operate as frontline responders to mental health crises. As a result, they would prefer more community resources for this purpose and/or a redirection of responsibilities to other organizations better equipped to handle mental health issues. Moving on to some other topics, participants expressed some innate fear and distrust of police just because of their power. People hope police understand this when the police approach them, even for what might be considered minor or non-threatening situations. The fear and distrust caused some of the participants to behave differently from normal, and they recognized this and thought that this could be part of the problem when there's sometimes negative interactions with police, that they themselves are behaving abnormally because of the stress and anxiety that they're feeling when they are stopped or pulled over by the police. Some people of color acknowledged that in their life experience and within their network of family and friends, they are taught to be mistrustful of police. As a result, some have literally developed rules, what we're calling, they didn't call it this is my word, protocols and procedures that go into effect when they are stopped by police, and they believe this is warranted and justified. They acknowledge that sometimes this can come off as being negative and hostile and uncooperative. For example, when they ask questions of police officers, sometimes maybe even demand information from police officers, they understand that that can be interpreted as being uncooperative and unresponsive, but they feel it's their right and frankly their need to do that as law-abiding citizens, or else be taken advantage of or perhaps mistreated. So they will sometimes ask and demand information from police officers. The most frequently cited example was asking for the officer's badge, having a video camera ready to video an incident, or calling out inappropriate use of language by police officers. There were some issues brought up of so-called nannying and puppy dogging. I didn't even know what that term meant, but apparently some people of color feel like they're being singled out because of where police choose to observe and patrol and who they stop. But interestingly, one person of color who had previously worked with the police department pointed out that they had had similar concerns, but in working with the police, what they learned is something pretty basic, which is that the more areas receive complaints and calls, the police are purposely patrolling in closer proximity to and spend more time in those areas. So it isn't about trying to single out a particular race, a particular type of person. It's really just about what kind of calls are being received. And actually, when other people of color in the focus groups heard that, they kind of had a little bit of an aha, oh, okay, I see. So I just wanted to point that out because, you have to figure out what the recommendations are. I don't know what those are, but clearly there's some educating that needs to be done among different groups of people. A couple of people of color said their interactions with police have been largely positive, and that they try not to immediately assume that they're being stopped or pulled over by police because they're not white. Most people are willing to give police the benefit of the doubt if their behavior is appropriate. But some obvious mismatch, we observe some obvious mismatch between what police and non-police think of as appropriate behavior. There were lots of comments about people being aggressive, rude, and disrespectful. And interestingly, it was sort of, I hate to call it on both sides, but it wasn't just the citizens saying that about the police. It was the police also saying that about some citizens, and I want to emphasize some, not all by any stretch, but a few that they have to deal with. Police participants expressed deep concern and frustration that they are under constant scrutiny and pressure. Most believe the reasons have to do with the negative coverage of the national media and overall political divide in the country, especially around race. I think one thing that struck me personally as I was listening with when we were doing the police focus groups with the police officers, I think only one of the questions that we asked them actually involved the term race or the use of race or ethnic identity, but most of the conversation that they were focused on centered around race, which kind of struck me as interesting. Like, they were very concerned about that issue, and I can talk more about some examples. The non-police participants felt the police needed more training, particularly in terms of more tools to deal with mental health, more cultural competence, more understanding of how to deal with females, and more language competence. And the next two things I want to read out here are just a few of the kind of quotes, messages that we sort of were hearing on, I don't want to say both sides because I'm making it sound like it's a binary, and it really wasn't, but the police message overall was that they wanted to let residents understand is we are people like you. And I mean this not as a Wausau Police Department as a whole, but as individuals. We sometimes have bad days. You're going to get what you give, meaning if you treat us respectfully, we will treat you respectfully. If you treat us disrespectfully, we may treat you disrespectfully. We are human. If we get something wrong, tell us. And that was another big, I think, important theme that the police wanted to get across. They understood that they're not perfect, and at least the frontline officers seemed very willing and eager, actually, to want to know if they're doing something incorrect so they can improve. And by the way, I didn't put this in here, and I kind of regret. It was one of those things that, like, after the fact, as I was writing this up, I thought this is another immediate takeaway I should have had. The police believed that they definitely have a pretty strong culture of accountability. If things are not, if an individual officer, if somebody's doing something wrong, somebody's behaving incorrectly, treating somebody like a citizen incorrectly, they believe that there are not only the values that are in place that are emphasized constantly within the police force, but that through actual accountability mechanisms, they are called to account. I think if I had to say, most of the non-police people don't know that there are accountability mechanisms. And when it was pointed out, when we might say things like, well, the police, if they were here in the room with us, might say that they do have accountability mechanisms, the kind of common response from the non-policing focus group participants was, well, then they should tell us. There should be more transparency because we are not aware of that, and that might help if we knew that. Okay, so that was a little added thing there. The non-police message, and again, I'm not trying to pass a judgment here. I just tried to capture what they said. We expect more from police. Police have training, and we do not. It is the police officer's responsibility to take the high road. We hold police to a higher standard. Now, some personal judgment. It sort of felt like the non-police folks really expected the police to be superhuman to some extent. And I think the police were trying to send a message of, we are not superhuman, if I had to sum it up. When it comes to the mental health of police officers, non-supervisors believe this is a serious concern, at least the ones we talked to. Now, granted, we talked to a very small number of non-supervisors, so with the size that we had, I don't think I can read any sort of statistical significance to this, so maybe we just got the few officers who really had dealt with personal mental health issues. But all of the ones we talked with said they had personal mental health challenges directly related to their job, and that they had sought help through mechanisms that the police offers. The one thing that they universally agreed is that they did not like and felt, in fact, some ways that it was inadequate and even unhelpful was the EAP, the Employee Assistance Program. They just felt that it really actually created more hassles and concerns than it solved problems. Now, when it came to the officers' mental health, the supervisors, right, the supervisors of the people I just mentioned, seemed to suggest that resources are adequate. When we asked them about the EAP specifically, they did acknowledge that online support has challenges. When we tried to ask them if mental health challenges were a serious concern within the ranks of the officers, they seemed reluctant to address that question as to whether or not it rose to the level of a serious concern. Again, I don't want to pass judgment on why that might be the case. They just did not seem to want to suggest that it was a serious concern. Non-police participants, so residents, almost down to a person, were very concerned about officers' mental health. And I do believe it was from a place of sincerity. They weren't looking to pass judgment. It was they really honestly believe that it's a stressful job. I want to focus a little more on some of the comments from the Hmong participants, and we had a significant number of Hmong participants, and we specifically focused on younger generation Hmong, and I'm kind of glad we did in hindsight, because I know there was some concern about, well, what did the older generation think? But actually, I think the younger generation really provided us some insight, not only into how things are changing, but also into how things are not changing. So I think it was actually a good group. So anyway, the Hmong participants acknowledge that Hmong culture is inherently distrustful of the police here locally. And frankly, as you probably know, most other forms of government and civil intervention. Even the younger generation understands and are taught that problems should be kept in-house, meaning within families and clans. The origins of this sentiment go back to Hmong elders feeling mistreated and misunderstood by white culture during early days of refugee resettlement here in the area. Combined with the inherent respect for elders that is taught in Hmong families, it is very difficult for Hmong residents, including younger residents who actually support the police, to feel comfortable or trustful around the police. For example, it is seen by many in the Hmong culture as the worst possible action that one can take to call the police on your family, even if someone is breaking the law. Because younger Hmong folks are more assimilated to U.S. culture and are less likely to require any special cultural competence, the one exception is, and this is what they wanted us to pass on to you, is to help the police understand, though, that they are still trained and taught and feeling as though they want to protect their elders in encounters with the police. And so they may behave even in ways that they don't fully agree with in order to respect the family elders. Participants reported that attitudes are changing among the younger Hmong generation, as I'm sure you know, but that it will take time before many Hmong people generally are more accepting of police intervention. So this was how the Hmong participants described their ideal police officer. Someone who has cultural competency, i.e. a basic understanding of Hmong culture, someone who's just generally compassionate and respectful, and someone who looks like us, as in looks like a Hmong person. The comfort level and familiarity were cited as big anxiety and stress reducers. If we know them and we know whose family they're coming from, we're going to be more apt to listen to them. However, these Hmong participants also recognize that this is an ideal and not a firm recipe for change. They acknowledge that police officer candidates have to meet a high standard of skills and character, regardless of race or ethnicity, and this, they understood, may limit the pool of qualified Hmong or other non-white candidates. Hmong participants also felt strongly that additional cultural competence, I know I mentioned that earlier, but this was definitely a strong message, was an important recommendation for the WPD. This was probably their most significant recommendation. Finally, Hmong participants acknowledged that even having a Hmong officer present may not be enough to break the protectiveness of clan structure. As a result, their recommendation, or their advice, if you will, for police officers, is that they must be willing to competently follow the law, especially in cases of domestic abuse and violence. In other words, as one person put it, they may at times have to be stern, polite but stern, with among culture. Otherwise, they may not get the sort of cooperation and behavior that they need to enforce the law. So I think I'm going to stop there and ask if you guys have questions, comments, or I can happily sit down as you guys contemplate any of that.
Are there any questions of Eric? First of all, I want to thank you for your quick turnaround in the work that you undertook to put together the focus groups and get that feedback. I think it will be helpful as another line of evidence that we look at. Mike?
So I'm assuming we're going to have a follow-up after this that will kind of summarize the entire process. So initially, we started with the listening sessions to help inform the survey. The survey then had conclusions and results, and we used the focus groups to help us inform and fill in the blanks from the survey. At some level, we'll kind of wrap that all up into recommendations, because there's a lot of interesting things in the work that you guys do with the focus groups that I think will be helpful to elaborate on, and I think there's just a lot that we just got to kind of put our arms around and boil down now. So I look forward to that.
Yeah, and one of the things John and I were talking about just late last week rather, is we want whatever report, whatever data that we've collected to be the most useful to you. So, for example, if you feel like there needs to be a section in your report that essentially summarizes, the 3 data collection processes and some of the key findings, we'll provide that. If you want them as literally 3 separate independent standing reports, we can also do that. I'm not sure that's the best way to approach it, but that is something we were prepared to do depending on what your needs are. So the short answer is yes.
In our conversation, I think we have to be careful that we not look to whips to do our job. And our job is to take that iterative process of building off of the listening sessions, the surveys, and the focus groups, and then figure out what issues or policy concerns are there and how we might move those ahead. So I think it's great to look to them to present the data, but I think the interpretation of the data, there'd be a limited interpretation, but it's going to be up to us to drill down and figure out what that means, that issue of cultural competency. How do we deal with that in the police force? But that really will be a task force challenge.
I would just second that. Our job, as we see it, is not to make recommendations at all. It's really to provide the data. So anytime I use the word recommendation, just know that is not coming from us or the team. This is what we heard people saying. So that's up to you to determine if you want to accept, what they're recommending.
Wilt, did you?
Yeah, well, first, I do want to thank you and your staff for the work that you've done the whole way. I wanted to find out, because the reason why we want to do some of these focus groups is to make sure that we were able to, get more participants in some of, especially in terms of minority groups. How do we do in terms of participant level?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. And John, somehow, I don't know how this happened, but you didn't get the version. You guys didn't get the version that actually had the stats in it. So I'm going to read some stats here for you. We had approximately 40 to 45 people, and the reason why it's a little uncertain is because there were a few people who couldn't attend the focus groups but who really wanted to have their voice shared, so we agreed that we would interview them, and there are a couple of people that were still in the process of interviewing, but there were just a few individuals. So out of about, let's say, 32 individuals who were not police officers, 34% were white, 25% were Hmong, 19% were black, 16% were, and these were all self-described. Not we didn't observe it. They described themselves. 16% were Hispanic. 6% reported as other. In terms of age, 47% of people were aged 31 to 50. Let's see here. I don't, for some, oh, here it is. Okay. 16% were over 51. Let's see here. 22% were aged 23 to 30, and 15% were aged 16 to 22. So if I had to kind of break that down a little differently, I would say you had about 40% of people who were somewhere between the ages of 16 and 30, and 60% who were over age 30.
And I apologize, I sent the earlier draft because there was
Yeah.
a string. So I
That's
will
okay.
forward that to Gene and we'll get it out to you with the
No
demographics.
problem. We had, out of the 32 people who actually did a survey, and not everybody did the survey at the end, we had a little survey, we had to do a little demographic survey, that's how I'm getting this data. 17% were just self-described homeowners. I'm sorry, 17 people were self-described homeowners, 15 people were self-described renters. Gender breakdown was high, much heavily about 65 to 70% female, 30 to 35% male. There was some non-binary also. I'm not sure I have any other data. I'm trying to think if we asked any other questions. Did that kind of answer your question? I don't know.
Yeah, just one follow-up, though. Did
Sure.
you, sort of as an observation, did you see within those focus groups as much of a stark difference in terms of the answers regarding age that we did before, or did it seem more similar in terms of responses?
That's a really good question. I think I'm going to have to really dig into it to feel confident giving you the answer. I will say that of the younger people that we talked with, the biggest concern I think that we heard over and over again would have to be around mental health issues and around whether or not the police were prepared to handle people with mental health issues. That was, I would say, the number one concern, and that seemed to cut across whatever their ethnic or racial or other background was. We did ask the question of the young people, why they thought that young people were slightly more negative toward the police or somewhat more negative towards the police than other age groups. And their own answers actually were kind of mirrored by the older generation and by the police themselves. Everyone sort of agreed that social media and media in general, the climate of the country that we live in, and sort of the uncertainty, the political uncertainty, all played a big impact on people's perceptions of the police, and acknowledged that even if they had had a negative interaction with police, like I said, they largely could also understand and see the police as being positive in their community, but the overall attitude toward police, because of things they've witnessed, is more negative. That's about as far as I think I can go at this point. Don't know if I feel comfortable saying more.
Any other questions?
But I will make sure that we note any significant differences across some of these demographic and age groups if we find any.
And again, I think what we're going to look at trying to do is pull those bodies together, and it'll be up to us to identify issues that need to be addressed in the context of our recommendations going forward. So,
I might chance one other observation, but again, this is a really small sample, so let's not make any statistical leaps and conclusions here. The people who came to the focus groups, as I mentioned, were largely self-selecting. And so I think the older folks who showed up tended to be folks who may have had a negative interaction with police at some point in their lives. And because they're older, They may have had more than one. So in some ways, this might sound like a little bit opposite of what I was just saying, but in some ways, maybe the older people that we had in the focus groups were a little bit more jaded in terms of some of their overall experiences. I think young people occasionally had reported some negative experience, but they seemed to be willing to give the police the benefit of the doubt, with the exception of they want to make sure that the police are better trained in responding to mental health crises. So let's leave it at that.
With that, thank you very much, Eric.
Okay, thank
We look
you.
forward to continuing our discussion.
Yep.
Next is develop recommendations for mental health services, CART team expansion, homeless outreach coordination, community-based case management services, transportation services. Ben, are you going to handle that? Matt's not here.
I thought this was a task force discussion, not a
Well, it is,
presentation from us.
so we've had discussions with, and it is, with North Central Healthcare. These are issues that we have talked about or have come up, and we've discussed in the past, and I think they were highlighted in the presentation by Matt Barnes a couple of meetings ago, but specifically, I think what we want to do is begin to look at what sort of recommendations we might want to advance and begin to identify those and move them forward. I think one of the things that we've heard is for the CART team, you currently have that Monday through Friday for 8 hours a day, and I know there have been some discussions about expanding that to both an evening shift and potentially weekends. There's been some discussion with North Central about costing that out. I think the cost is about 100, if we were to expand it to 20 hours on a weekend and a second shift. The net cost after there's an opportunity to tie into funding sources might be $50,000 with a cost of 130-ish thousand with a revenue stream of 80,000. Any thoughts on the issue of CART expansion, the Crisis Assessment Response Team? Michael?
From my experience, the majority of calls from a mental health standpoint are going to occur from about 3 p.m. until midnight. And so that's a primary that we're not covering. I understand what's happening during the days, but from a crisis response standpoint, that's the highest peak volume. So I would suggest that that would be part of our recommendation, is covering those key times, and then into the weekends, certainly. I would be cautious about trying to bill through CART. Some of the feedback that we got at North Central Healthcare during the time I was there was that people often didn't realize they would be billed for a service. It's like showing up in the emergency room, and so there's a billing for that. And if we do that with a CART team, that might be problematic. So as we pursue funding sources, I would caution charging for CART-related services if possible. But definitely expanding to that second shift would be a key recommendation from my perspective.
Do we want to begin to take action relative to individual items? I think it would be helpful because we're nearing, we're at that year time frame. I think we need to begin to move things along.
I think some of the things that we've seen, I mean, this is a repeated from multiple perspectives. We've heard this as a need and an area of improvement. And so I think on a 20,000-foot level, we can start fleshing some things out that we have a sense. I guess it's sort of the process question of how are we going to present this at the end and things like that, and what does that look like? But I do think that, I think sitting around here and listening, we all are sort of like, there's a need there. And so it does make sense at some level to move forward with it.
So I think what I would look for today is sort of a motion in concept to advance it. And I think understanding that ultimately all of the recommendations will be coming back for clarification, tweaking, and approval. Will?
Say two things. So I think since we've started this task force, We've had a number of presentations, and universally, I think in terms of CART, there's been approval from the focus groups, from our studies. People out there approve of CART, and the need, just the weekends and evenings seem like common sense in terms of having those people there. So I will make a first motion to advance recommendations for the expansion of CART and costing that out so that we can present that to get that funding and hopefully move that forward for expansion.
So for purposes of clarity, did that reflect that 3 PM to midnight and weekends?
Correct.
Okay.
I second that.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of that motion will signify by saying aye.
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 That motion, or opposed? That motion carries unanimously. I heard everyone, so. Second issue is homeless outreach coordination. And I think that discussion centers around what is the role of the police department versus what is the role of the community. Officer Lemeron has done an outstanding job with interfacing with the homeless community, but I think that there are limitations into where the police department can go. And the question is whether we should be calling upon community resources to be dedicated toward coordinating outreach efforts and services to the homeless outside of the context of the police department. Ben, is that capturing?
I think it partially captures what we've been discussing, at least internally within the police department. So Officer Lemeron has been assigned to homeless outreach for over a year. We've worked closely with North Central Healthcare, of course, in developing that program. Officer Lemeron is going to be transitioning into the crisis assessment response team at the end of this year. And so, and also we removed him from his patrol officer responsibilities when we created that position last year. And so we are going to be transitioning that position back into the patrol officer bureau. We're not going to fill that homeless outreach position right now. North Central Healthcare is committed to maintaining their position and still doing work with that team and with doing the outreach into the community. One of our concerns is that we have seen Officer Lemeron's daily work with our homeless population yield great benefits for our community and for the population, for the homeless population. And we need somebody in our community that is going to be the daily community outreach individual that Eric has done for the last year, because we haven't seen that from other organizations. There's a lot of people doing really good work around homelessness, but nobody's doing that out in the community, boots on the ground work. So one of the things we've been discussing internally, I think, we've talked to the mayor and to Chair Robinson about this idea is that we don't think it's appropriate to have a law enforcement officer doing that work. We're not specialized in it. We don't have the resources at our disposal. However, we saw a need and we filled the need in the community. But we would like to have somebody, whether it's somebody employed by the police department, by the city, or somewhere else, doing that outreach work. I think we could have a position within the police department that is able to go out into the community and do that work. We want somebody who is has experience that can go into task force meetings and speak intelligently and articulately about the issue and be able to influence people to make things happen for individuals and for the community in terms of policy and things that we're doing as a community. I think that would be appropriate, somebody who has maybe a social work background or experience working in some of the homelessness nonprofits in our community, something like that. That's kind of what we've been discussing internally, not just stepping away from that or asking other people to do it, but filling that void with a non-sworn position. I think having having somebody that works for us that we can direct to be out in the community, boots on the ground, doing that work is important, because we haven't seen that from other organizations.
Just to piggyback on that, the Community Partners Campus creates some unique opportunities, I think, for some of this coordination that has historically not been taking place on a community level. So there may be opportunities to design that into their programming as they advance that concept in that building. So any thoughts? Do you have enough information to act, and do you have any thoughts as to how we ought to act?
I think on this one, because I kind of had the same thought in terms of the community campus partners. I think, or at least my idea would be to approach the nonprofits and see if they would be willing to get together to, as part of that moving forward, to create a position for a person. And I think in partnership with the police department had one person that those two people could kind of communicate, but that other person do the vein out there in the community, and the police liaison sort of work with to provide information, and they kind of work together. One paying, the nonprofits obviously paying for that one position, the police department paying for that position. But I think we would need to probably reach out to them first and see how that, if that's an idea or whatever the idea moving forward with in terms of their participation.
We can have that discussion with Kevin, Carrie, and Ryan, Gumnus, Noel, and
I mean, I'd be direct. I don't think that's the appropriate people to go to. I mean, they're wonderful people doing great things with Community Partners Campus, but their goal is to create a facility where people, all of these nonprofits, can go and be the hub. I don't think that they have the intention of developing positions and hiring people to do that work. They're going to be a place for other nonprofits to go and do that work. So I would say, if we're looking to do outreach for that position, it's probably, Catholic Charities or Central Community Action Program, Salvation Army, probably one of those three.
any thoughts, or do we want to think about that and come back at the next meeting?
We can come back to it, but I mean, clearly what we need is a social worker. Somebody with a social work background that can navigate all the different systems. And, when you're suffering from a mental illness or addiction, that's the last thing you're going to be able to do. Most people that, are of sound mind have trouble navigating some of those systems sometimes, and getting it all together. So having people that can figure that out and get people the resources is key, and it's social work. I mean, that's what that is. So I would recommend that that would be one of our recommendations, is that we not use a police officer and we get somebody that's trained in those skills to do that work. It's important work. It's obviously needed every day in the community. They probably could house out of the community campus, house out of there or be a landing spot and connect with people there every day. But, that's not the right organization, I don't think, to manage it either. I would agree with the chief on that.
So did I understand you to make a motion that you support continuation of the services, but that the focus be shift from a police officer to a social worker?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Just have one question.
Is there a second?
I'm sorry. I'll second so we can move forward with
All right,
discussion.
now go ahead.
Sorry. So, I agree with what Michael said. Doesn't, in terms of whoever it comes from, needs to be a social worker and someone who has a lot of experience dealing with community. My only other piece would be just that there still be some coordination, though I think is important, with some person in the police department to make sure, so that police department doesn't become removed from that process.
Yeah, like I said, I'll just reiterate. I think it would be a great idea, and I would advocate for this, is to have that position work for the police department. We saw many times Eric Lemeron's work was successful because he can walk into businesses and places where we need to get things accomplished, and because he comes in uniform, he's able to make things happen more quickly than normal. And we saw that many, many times. So if we have a social worker working out of the police department who has all of that background and skills, they don't need to have a police officer with them much, but when they do, it's easy access to come to the police department and say, hey, I need somebody to come with me to do X, Y, or Z, whatever that task is. And it keeps us connected. And frankly, we've seen a lot of great progress because of the work our officers at the police department have done, and I would like to continue that traction, continue that work.
I'm going to just interrupt. I know, Michael, you've got a commitment. Okay, all right. Any other discussion? We can flush out some of the details, but I think what we're trying to do tonight is capture the concept.
I do think it's important that we note that it be housed in the police department for all the points that have been made.
So,
I support that.
so as a clarifying amendment, we will add that the position housed in the police department, but not a police officer, but rather a social worker. Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Community-based case management service. This is the person that kind of follows and tracks the individual to make sure that once they're released, they do the follow-up and working with them on a basis, basically taking a combination of a medical and a mental health model and making sure the person's getting to where they need to go and providing support services and coordinating those activities so you don't have compliance only to have a fall off because they're not doing what they should be doing.
With that one, I do think that, the idea of it's really great. I can tell you that for the last probably 3 years at North Central Healthcare, we were really wrestling with this idea, and I think North Central Healthcare is the right person or entity to be leaned on to do better in this regard, and they are committed to doing that. I do not think that this is a role of the police department, from my perspective, on the Police and Fire Commission and, working in police organizations. North Central Healthcare is capable, and they are positioning and working towards being able to do this better. The issue that we were always dealing with was, if somebody wasn't on a commitment or if they didn't have, they weren't willing to participate in treatment, and it was like, then what? And they're coming up with a solution to address that. I know that I have confidence that they'll be able to do that, and we should lean on them and make our recommendation for them to continue to pursue those strategies, because they are the entity best situated to develop this kind of model, in my opinion. But I'm biased, I guess, in that regard.
Was that a motion to make a recommendation that North Central Healthcare, we request North Central Healthcare continue to pursue strategies and services to provide effective case management services? That's what I thought I heard you say.
You're very good tonight, John.
And I'll second that.
Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. The final area for tonight is the issue of transportation services. This gets into making sure people get to where they need to be. And it's not necessarily the traditional bus route, but rather making sure that we're getting somebody from their home to treatment, other medical places, following up with appropriated. There are opportunities. I'll just bring some context. The Wausau Metro is in the process of doing a transit improvement plan. They have a consultant coming in looking at not only the traditional fixed bus routes, but also looking at potential of how we might be able to integrate that with other services, and are there opportunities to have on-demand services moving people from their home to somewhere else. It's a stretch, but that's the concept. And I know, Will, that you've been very interested in this concept, and it's an area that's lacking. I'm not sure we have the answer, but any thoughts? Did I capture it?
I think you did capture it. I think just in addition to what you said, I would say that a large part of the issue and why this has arisen is a result of the work with our homeless population and their ability not just to get a ride somewhere, but to pay for a ride to get somewhere. They don't have the funds to do that, and so they need to get to court, go to job interviews, go to counseling sessions, go to the DMV, all of those things, and they don't have any ability to do that, or very limited ability to do that. Again, Officer Lemerand did a lot of that when he was in that position, but people don't want to be riding in a squad car often, and that's not necessarily our role either. So if there's a way to coordinate those services or funding for those services, I think that would be very helpful.
I would like to add something. I think it might be helpful to the consultant and the oversight committee that's forming on this, if the police department and via this committee could provide sort of why those things are important, and specifically in terms of what the police see in terms of the consultant making recommendations.
Yeah, we'd be happy to present or give you information. Just tell us when and what you need.
That would be my recommendation, is we'd have Officer Lemeron present on his experience relative to transportation over the last year working in that role.
Is there a second to that?
I'll second.
Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all is in favor of that, that motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, thank you. We will work on some additional topics for the next meeting. I want to quickly just give you an update on legislation, and not all of these were necessarily things that came out of the speaker's task force on, on policing, but others. There were 26 different bills that were introduced in the legislature thus far this year that I was able to track. 4 have become law. One is law requiring law enforcement agency policies on the use of force. That's Act 75, Act 49, public access to police, to policies regarding the use of force. There is Act 50, requiring law enforcement reporting law enforcement's use of force incidents into a database, and then it is creation of an independent use of force advisory board. Act 48 was passed. There was one bill that was vetoed that dealt with decreasing shared revenue payments to municipalities based upon decreased funding to law enforcement agencies. There has been a bill that has been enrolled, which means it's passed both houses and waiting, being sent to the governor relative to responsibilities of Law Enforcement Standards Board and disclosure of employment files when recruiting former and current officers. There are a number of bills that have passed the Assembly alone, but have not been taken up, including the reporting the use of no-knock entry at the execution of search warrants, school resource officers' standards and training requirements, requiring law enforcement officers to complete a psychological exam prior to employment, and granting rulemaking authority, crisis training for, requiring crisis training for law enforcement officials, creating a crisis enhancement grant program, drug testing for law enforcement officers involved in certain critical incidents while on duty, giving grants for body cameras. And there have been a number of other bills that have been introduced and not had a hearing in both the Assembly and in the Senate. I'm not going to go through those tonight, but a number of the pieces of legislation have advanced. A couple of them have become law. We'll do a comparison of where those track up with the speaker's recommendations. And Ben, do you want to add anything relative to the department?
I can certainly answer any questions about our procedures as they relate to some of the bills. A lot of the bills that are being introduced that Chair Robinson just talked about, we already have policies around some of these ideas. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if you're looking for any input from me on what I think of these items.
Mike?
So I've looked at these like 3 times now, and I'm just trying to think to myself, what can we help with? Which is, the state put together a task force, and typically when they do task force, it becomes, bills that there's usually pretty good consensus there. And I'm just thinking through these, and we're either in compliance with all these and prepared, or would be supportive of them if they were to pass. And there's really nothing in here that I saw that from our discussions that we wouldn't support if they were passed. Is that the case from your perspective, or is there any part that?
I would say for the most part, that's true. I mean, there are some things that I would say it depends on what the language is and how things are implemented. So one example would be the Independent Use of Force Board. So before I would say I'm supportive of that, I want to know, what does that look like? What is the makeup of the board? Is it politically motivated? How are people appointed to that board? I think in theory the idea sounds reasonable. It sounds good. With that said, we do a lot of use of force review in our training. We create training around use of force incidents across the country. So we do a lot of that already. So I would want to know, what is that board going to consist of? So that's just one example, I guess.
All good questions, and I would assume you would track that, but you and the mayor are both appointed to some fancy board relative to these issues, right?
We're appointed to the Law Enforcement Standards Board, which is the.
That's fancy. Have I read that?
I don't know
That's
if it's
important.
fancy or not, but it's the state board that certifies law enforcement officers in the state, that sets requirements for that certification. So, yeah, we do have some input into that, although I think some of this legislation would be looking out for LESB to implement certain things that they're saying we have to do. So, like that use of force board, and what does that look like?
So from my perspective, given all the time we've spent on these issues, it would be important, and it is important that both of you continue to serve on that. But that's certainly not our authority.
Right.
But I'm just trying to think if there's anything in here that if we were to make a recommendation would actually support it getting done or not. I'm not sure that that's the case if I look at these things.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the case either.
If I could lump the bills into categories, the Assembly seems to have been much more aggressive with the understanding that you had the Speaker's task force in the Assembly in passing legislation. The Senate, many of the bills that passed the Assembly have not had a hearing yet in the Senate. And then you have a series of bills, some of them companion to the other ones that were introduced by Democrats, so you had a series of Republican bills. Those bills have gone absolutely nowhere. They haven't had hearings. They're at the fiscal estimate. Whether they're good public policy or not, they deal with body cameras requiring the use of decertification of law enforcement, tribal law enforcement, jail and juvenile detention officers under certain circumstances, law enforcement policies and the use of force, which is similar to one that passed. But I think it makes sense for us to probably focus in on those that have passed and maybe look and see there's 6, 7 of those that have passed, that one house is there merit in trying to push the Senate to move it along, so we can bring those in next meeting, if that makes sense.
If I can give my 2 cents, I guess, with the bills that I've seen that are being proposed, I'm not sure that they're going to have a lot of bearing on this task force, to be honest. I mean, there's some legislation I think that's important statewide, and that's what the legislators see. But from a operational standpoint within the city, in our local jurisdiction, I'm not sure if it'll have a lot of relevance within the task force itself, short of maybe if you think there's something that you need to support and let the legislature know that the City of Wausau Task Force supports that politically. Maybe that would be worthwhile, but
I think the ones
That's
that would
right.
jump out at me, Ben, would be school resource officer standards and training. I know that we do that, require law officers to complete a psychological exam prior to hire, and then drug testing of law enforcement officials in certain critical incidents while on duty.
yeah, so the SRO, the school resource officer bill, that would require certain training, we almost certainly already surpass whatever minimum requirements are going to be put in place. I think in terms of the drug testing after an officer-involved shooting, my opinion is that is a solution in search of a problem. We in the city of Wausau, I know there's a lot of jurisdictions around the state that do this the same way. When there are officers involved in a critical incident, usually it's a shooting, we ask them to consent to a chemical test of their blood. We take them to the hospital, and we have never had them say no because they recognize that it's usually in their best interest to take that test and prove that there's nothing in their blood. There's a lot of agencies that do that exact same protocol. There are some that require the test, and so I'm not sure why that's being made into an issue here in the state of Wisconsin, because we generally do a pretty good job with that. And what was the middle?
Psychological exam.
Yeah, I mean, we have a couple members from our Police and Fire Commission here. I think they would agree with what I'm about to say is I would never get rid of our psychological examination in our hiring process. We do that. We've been doing it since before I was hired as a police officer. It's critically important to the work that we do here.
So in essence, we're already doing those policies.
Yeah,
so-
the PFC requires it as part of the hiring process.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in the Police and Fire Manual. Mhm.
So then that may be for standards for others, not for us. So,
Yeah, and the last thing I would say, kind of in that same vein, I shouldn't say a lot, some agencies that are small that hire part-time officers where there's a lot of turnover, they don't have a lot of funding, and so that psychological examination, they want to do it, but it's costly and they're doing it over and over and over again because there's a lot of turnover of those part-time positions. So I would say, not just in relation to the psychological, but any legislation that's creating a requirement that a city fund something, I think we need to be especially cautious of what is it going to cost and how are we going to pay for it. There's some other legislation around that too, around certain things that might cost money, and even time. I mean, there's a requirement, a bill that would require mental health training on a biannual basis of 4 or 8 hours for every police officer in the state of Wisconsin. I'm not opposed to mental health training, but we have a lot of training requirements already in place, and to mandate a annual or biannual training for mental health, I think is a lot to ask. So that's another example of some requirements that I think we just need to pay attention to. What are they asking of us? What is it going to cost in terms of not just money, but also time resource?
any other thoughts?
I just have a quick question. 'Cause I don't know if this is one of the considerations. I haven't looked at those yet. Last time I had brought up possibility of us seeing up a resolution in regards to creating a ethics committee regarding certification when an officer is dismissed or leaves because he's done something wrong, instead of just shopping around and going to the next, a way to that the state oversees it, similar to the process that lawyers go to. Is any of that being considered anywhere, or is that something just that we would probably just make a resolution to, from our perspective, possibly?
Yeah, there's a couple of bills that I think pertain to that. One is in regards to expanding LESB, the Law Enforcement Standards Board's authority for decertification. And so that would ask LESB to set up a process for just what you're describing, to expand the ability to decertify. Right now, LESB's ability to decertify an officer really is pretty limited to, if somebody committed a crime and is convicted of a crime, if a police officer committed a crime that no longer allows them to be able to carry a firearm, so a domestic violence offense or a felony offense, then we can decertify them. LASB can decertify that officer. But there isn't a, like a hearing process for a citizen complaint for excessive use of force where the LASB can decertify for that. Now, a police chief or a police and fire commission can terminate employment for that, but not necessarily decertify for something like that unless a crime was committed and charged and convicted. So that bill exists. There's also a bill that is proposing more transparency in officer personnel files to try to eliminate officers who jump from agency to agency after committing acts of misconduct. I don't think it's necessarily as much of an issue accessing personnel files, because what we do in the hiring process is when we're going to do a background investigation, we have a form that our candidate signs that says, you can go talk to my past employers, you can look in their personnel file, I authorize you to show them my personnel file, et cetera, et cetera. We look in those personnel files, we rarely are met with the resistance from another police. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Michael, we don't have our next meeting date set. Well, before,
I've got to go to hockey pictures, so sorry.
okay, just on a Monday is generally.
Yep, this is all good.
Okay, all right.
Smile big.
All right, sorry, Ben.
Smile big. So when we do our background investigations, go to other agencies where our candidate for police officer has worked previously, we are rarely met with an answer that says we can't look at their personnel file. Almost always we can do it. I think the issue generally lies in the hiring agency that doesn't go to those agencies and ask to see the file. They don't do a proper background investigation. So I don't think it's necessarily access to the files. That's what the bill is like. I'm supportive of it, but I don't think that necessarily fixes the problem, because you still have to go look in the file to see what's there.
And that has passed both houses. It has been enrolled, but just not sent to the governor. That's AB 190 or SB 165.
But there are some police departments when they, either the Police and Fire Commission terminates an employee or an employee comes to agreement and resigns in lieu of termination. Sometimes the department might say, hey, if you resign, I won't show your file, or I'll give you a neutral reference. So that then, this bill then allows us to get to the bottom of the situation when those agreements are reached.
And I would agree with that in terms of personnel file. I think the better one on that is expanding LSB on decertification, because from a lawyer's perspective, if we just sort of moved along in terms of, lawyers that create misconduct or whatever, they could easily move to their friend's, firm or whatever else. Some of them it's not looking at the file. Some of them look at the file but may know them and decide, hey, I'm going to hire them anyway. So having that board which says you have to come before us, you committed this first, and then we'll look at sort of what, misconduct, and again, not just whether or not they committed a crime, but whether or not they are upholding the values that could lead to something serious. I think that would be my preference. That's what I definitely support.
So I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're advocating that there's legislation that allows the Law Enforcement Standards Board to have a decertification process in a hearing. And
Correct. The
that
expansion of that,
So-
like the ethics committee for.
Right. And I'm not saying that that's a bad idea. I think that's probably a good idea. State of Wisconsin isn't set up for that right now. There's the Law Enforcement Standards Board doesn't have the staff or the time right now to do that. So that's a heavy lift. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's not possible, just that, it's a heavy lift if we're going to have that done.
No, I get that.
Isn't that why you get paid the large sum to be on the Police and Fire Commission?
Well, not exactly, because Police and Fire Commission, we can only look at what's here, as opposed to looking at, someone having to submit those through the state. having that process overseen like we do for the lawyers. I get it's a heavy lift, but, sometimes you got to initiate it from somewhere, right? And at
I
least
agree.
start the conversation.
Yep.
All right, thank you. All right, we will move on to task force timelines and deliverables. As Ben has told me repeatedly in private, it's time for us to get done, get her done, get to it. So what I'd like to do is just lay out what I perceive is sort of how our report might begin to look and see if there's concurrence on that. I think it's important that we give some context to why we met, why were we formed in terms of the charter, what led to us being formed, what process did we use, and then we would get into the fact that we spent considerable time on policy review, looking at the internal policies and how it worked, the hiring practices, others. Then talk about our public engagement process. Then we would move on to the issue of what were the needs that were identified, both internal to the department, external. I think we started to talk about some of those, but I think needs are separate from policy recommendations. We would then move on to a section of policy recommendations. What do we want to see as we come out of this at the end of the day? And then part of that would be, there would be some process things. We started the survey. Do we want the survey to continue? These are just things that I would throw out. There were issues of cultural competencies and that whole issue of the mental health services and partnerships and clarifications of roles. But does that make sense from a layout perspective of how we might approach our report? Mike, I'd look to you.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. I think I will agree with the chief that, we need to start moving this and getting stuff out there. I think that the process you laid out is good. I'd like to spend a little bit more time. I personally I haven't read the qualitative stuff yet. Will be honest, I'm a little concerned about the EAP, critique, and when you look at mental health and officers and behaviors and things, I may need to advocate that gets pushed to the forefront a little bit. If they have that feeling, or if they're not feeling that sense of connection, we might need to make some recommendations off that. But otherwise, no, I think it's well worded for me.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
Thank you for reminding me about the EAP. That's been a concern for our staff and for me for a couple of years at least now. It's an issue that's brought up to me pretty regularly from our staff, that they would like a law enforcement specific EAP provider. I think our EAP contract is coming up. I think it's expiring at the end of this year. I've had very preliminary communication with our human resources director on that issue, but it's definitely something that needs to be addressed in my opinion. So thank you.
Yeah, EAP is a great service, but when you are dealing with a different scenario every day, it's a different. This is not, I'm having a problem with my husband, my boss is bothering me. I have fear when I go home. I think somebody's following me. I had to pull my gun on a kid today and it scared me. These are different levels of conversations. And when we're looking at how can we better our police department, we have to work and think about them and how they can do their job best. So,
Yeah, you're exactly right. And one of the things that we've talked about in our profession, in a variety of different chief groups that I belong to, is when a police officer is going to see a counselor for whatever the job-specific issue is, they often say things that shock the counselor. And they see it in the counselor, and that's not a good thing. And beyond that, the counselor doesn't necessarily understand what law enforcement's required to do in certain situations, how to carry out the job, that kind of thing. So they spend time in a counseling session explaining these things to a counselor, which makes them not want to go back, which isn't a good thing either. So for those reasons and a variety of others, we need a law enforcement specific EAP provider, somebody who understands law enforcement.
Why don't we will put that specific topic on the agenda for the next meeting. Give us time to both craft or think, to look at the issue a little bit more thoroughly and then develop a recommendation. Anything else? One of the things that I would like to just make sure we get in there, we've got the neighbor-to-neighbor program, and I will be, at the next meeting, I would like to see that expanded to the Hmong, specifically to the Hmong and other minority communities just to have that community outreach, but we'll try to look as a way of dealing with some of those cultural competencies and understandings, so we'll look at how we can address that. Anything else? So when do we want to do that? Three weeks would be the 15th. How does that fare with other schedules and conflicts?
Public health and safety night, so they're here till 7.
Okay.
I think last time we just started at 7 instead of 6:30.
Do you want to just start at 7? Start at 7? Is that okay? I'm seeing nods. So we'll do it the 15th at 7 p.m. in here. All right. Anything else? If not, thank you all. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you all.